Hi class, welcome back. Today we're going to be working on the skull, identifying the major structures of the skull or the bones, and then the structures, and we'll talk a little bit about their function as well. Okay, all right, so let's start with, so this is the entire skull. Remember, as we talked about earlier, the top part is the cranium, and then the part that comes loose here is the mandible. So right now it's attached by a spring. We'll leave it on there for now. All right, so this first structure here that we'll look at is the frontal bones. That's here, just like the frontal region. So we have the frontal bone right here, okay? And as you'll notice, we have some sutures. These are the joints of the skull. They're sutures. They're totally immovable joints. Okay, so fibrous joints there. Okay, this is known as the coronal suture. Okay, and the coronal suture goes in between the frontal and the parietal bone. So there's a parietal bone. So now we're looking at the superior end. The parietal bone runs on either side. So hold the skull like this. Runs on either side. Okay, left and right, lateral sides. If we turn it around, we have the suture that separates the left from the right here. This is the sagittal suture, just like we learned a sagittal cut. Okay, sagittal cut. Coronal suture, like a coronal cut. Okay, all right. And then just inferior to the parietal bone is the temporal bone right here. We talked a bit about this in class as well. So the temporal bone, this is known as the squamosal suture right here. And it goes all the way down like this, underneath here. It articulates with the mandible or the lower jaw, and also forms the back portion of your jaw, your cheekbones right here. So it goes all the way to this suture line here, okay, to form the back end of your cheekbone, okay? And then posteriorly, the most posterior part, as well as inferior part of our skull, is the occipital bone, just like our occipital region, the occipital bone here. Okay. All right. So let's see. Some other bones that we have not talked about yet are, and the occipital bone goes all the way underneath, and you'll notice here it's going to articulate with our vertebrae down below here at these two spots there. Okay, all right. Some other bones to know of the skull. So if we look a little bit closer, it's almost like the wings over here. These just kind of come right out. They jut right out right here. This is the sphenoid bone, the sphenoid bone. So it comes out a little bit here. We can see a little bit. Let's see if we can find it inside. It also forms this part of the inner eye right here, right there. So that's also the sphenoid, makes up the posterior part of the eye socket here, or the orbital. Okay, we've got the frontal here, all right, here on this side as well, sphenoid bone. Okay, and then just here, what forms the other part of the cheek, okay, is the zygomatic bone, and that runs from the frontal here, follows that suture along the sphenoid bone, comes all the way down, suture down here, okay, and then it articulates here, okay, with our temporal bone or temporal bone. All right, so that's our zygomatic bone, and then we have our maxilla right here. So these are all the facial bones, the maxilla, which articulates with the zygomatic bone here. Okay, it comes up a little bit into the eye back here, and it's going to meet up with the nasal bones. These are two nasal bones, one on each side there. We got that? Okay, nasal bones. All right. Over here is the vomer. Back here, can you see that in there? That's our vomer. Okay. You'll also notice that there is a suture that separates the right maxilla from the left maxilla. Okay. And let's see, what else do we need to know? Oh, if we look all the way right in here, the corner of our eye, we have this lacrimal bone. Lacrimal relates to tearing, okay, tearing up. So our tear ducts are actually, there's no hole there, but if we looked at a real skull in the classroom, we have one, you would see a couple little holes there to allow for tear ducts to come through. Okay, all right, what else have we got here? Oh, back here, if we look down below, we've got what's called an ethmoid bone. An ethmoid bone. We're going to open this up a little bit so we can see more inside. And then underneath, let's see, we have our mandible. Okay, I am going to take off the mandible so we can get a little closer. Okay, there we go. All right. Okay, so let's look underneath. Let's start with, where should we start? All right, so we've got the major bones of the skull. Let's start with the frontal bone, some of the features of the frontal bone that I would like for you to know, okay? All right, so the first one, we learned earlier that we have these things called foramen. Foramen are holes that allow for blood vessels and nervous tissue to pass through. All right, so let's look at the first one. So this is our frontal bone here. So the first one we're looking at is just above the eye. So remember, this is the orbital, the eye, okay? And just above the eye, you can see better on the side right there, there is a foramen. See that? Little foramen right there, okay? And so this is called the supra, like superior, orbital, because it's your eye, and foramen, because, well, it's a hole, it's a foramen. All right. Now, in some cases, and it all depends on the human and just their stages of development, the supraorbital foramen sometimes are just a little notch, almost like a little cut in the bone, rather than a full closed-in foramen. Okay, so this one is a foramen, but in class you'll probably notice that there are some with just a notch. Okay, let's see if we can find where those are in class. All right. Okay, so what else do we need to know? We also need to know the supraorbital margin right here. So this is the margin. Think of like the margin of your papers, right, on the edges. So this is the supraorbital margin. Okay, that's going to be particularly important when we start looking at forensic anthropology with identifying skulls. We're going to be taking a look at the shape of the supraorbital margin over here. Okay, and another feature known as the the frontal sinuses. Remember, sinuses are holes within. Now, this one's going to be a little more difficult to spot. They just don't make them very well in our models, but in the sample at school, our real example, you're going to notice that. So here's the superior part of our skull. There's generally a space within here. We're not able to see it on here. They don't do that on these models, nor do they seem to do that here. But ultimately, right above that sort of ridge over here, that brow, you have a little bit of a space. I don't know if you'll be able to see it here. Let's see if I can turn that up. Okay. So it's almost like this gouging. I don't know. I guess you'd have to feel it. We'll take a look at that closer at school as well. There is a sinus, which is just a hollowed out area, and it serves a couple functions. It allows for these sinuses. It allows for good amounts. The angles allow for really good pressure sites, kind of like bridges that are aligned at angles. They add for considerable amount of support, But by having the holes, it also lightens up the skull, so it's a lot less, well, weight to carry around and a lot less pressure or tension on the neck. You tend to find this a lot in animals that have very, very large skulls, such as elephants and giraffes. Their skulls are really, really heavy, especially for a giraffe with that long neck. That could do significant damage. So they tend to have a lot of sinuses within their skull. So it allows them to have lots of angles for compression and structure while still reducing the amount of weight. Okay, so that's a sinus over here. Okay, it sort of forms to the top and back of your eyeball as well, so it would actually be within here. So all of that's the frontal sinuses. Okay, and whenever you end up with pain in back of your eyes, oh my goodness, you have such a headache, especially when you've got a cold, it's because of you have a sinus infection. Okay, all right, so that's the frontal bone. All right, so now let's take a look at the occipital bone. Okay, so we have the occipital bone here, which is the back portion. Okay, and we've got a couple structures I would like for you to know there. We have what's called the occipital condyle. That's this right here. Remember, condyle are these sort of roundish, generally very smooth surfaces where they articulate with another joint and almost sits like a cradle. They kind of cradle. It almost reminds me of, I don't know if you can see it, it reminds me of the bottom of the legs of a rocking chair. So it allows your head to just kind of, if I place it like this, allows your head to rock back and forth on your neck, as if to say yes. Okay, all right, so this is known as the occipital condyle. So condyle because it's sort of this curved shape where it articulates into something, allows for that movement, and occipital because it's the occipital bone. All right, another really important feature on the occipital bone, super important, is the occipital, right there, you see that? Not occipital, but the foramen magnum. Foramen because hole, magnum means large. Okay, a large hole, and this is where our spinal cord will pass through. Okay, the next structure I would like for you to know is this one right here. You could probably feel it sort of at that bottom curvature. Some have more pronounced one. This is called the external occipital protuberance. External is on the outside, protuberance sticks out, and occipital is the occipital bone. There's also an internal one. You don't need to know that, but I'll show it to you anyway. See, that's the other side of it. On the inside, this would be the internal occipital protuberance. Okay, but you just need to know the external occipital protuberance right there. Okay. Okay. All right. There's one more structure actually that I'd like to talk about. Let's get the top of our cranium right here. We'll just pop that thing back on over here. Okay. And so here we go. We have this other suture known as the lambdoid suture. Lambdoid, or lambdoidal, excuse me, suture. Lambdoidal. So it's going to separate the occipital from the parietal bone. Okay, so that's our occipital bone. Let's take a look at the temporal bone now. Okay, so the temporal bone here, right here, all right, a couple structures again. So we have the squamosal suture. I don't know, how can we remember that? Almost like a squamous cell, maybe? I don't know, right? So it's kind of squished lower, who knows? Okay, so that's one way to remember it. All right, so let's see what we have here. So first, you remember how I told you a few moments ago about our cheekbone here? Okay, this is known as the zygomatic process. All right, don't get tricked by that. It is a temporal bone, but because it's going to articulate with the zygomatic bone here, okay, it's the zygomatic process, all right, zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Okay, so it's zygomatic process, all right. Now, you're going to notice later on that this is called the temporal process, but let's just worry about zygomatic process. Okay, and what else do we need to know? Let's consult my list. Yes. The external auditory meatus, let me just turn it over like that. See right in here? Right. There is a canal, although this is not a real skull, so it's not a total canal, doesn't go all the way in, but this is, there we go. the external auditory meatus. This is where the passageway that sends sound waves from our environment into our skull, and then we can make sense of what those waves refer to. Okay. What else do we need to know for the temporal bone? The mastoid process. Okay, so that's this big, right, mastoid, like a massive process. Okay, so we've got two of them, one on each side. We've got one here and one right there, mastoid process. Okay, this is going to attach to a muscle called the sternocleidomastoid. We'll get to that when we get to the muscle system. Okay, but that's going to attach back here, and you can actually feel that muscle. It goes all the way down. It's going to articulate with our clavicle bone. Okay, all right, as well as our sternum. Okay, it's going to allow us to do things like this. Okay, then this really smaller one, really tiny, thin one here. Okay, can you see that there? All right, yeah, there we go. Right there. This is called the styloid process. Anytime you hear, you're going to see a couple styloid process if you haven't already. Styloid processes tend to be very, very thin. Okay, so this is the styloid process of the temporal bone, styloid process. Okay, so we've got mastoid process, styloid process, external auditory meatus, right there, zygomatic process, all of the temporal bone, and we have one more structure to talk about. So this, on my model, they tend to use this little plasticky type thing. This is where the mandible will articulate, right in here. So our mandibular, hold that over there, our mandibular condyle, smooth rocking surface, will articulate with the mandibular fossa right in there. Okay, so mandibular fossa right there. Okay, so mandibular fossa, right? Found on humans. Mandibular fossa. All right, quick trivial question. What do you call a mandibular fossa on a cow? A moo fossa. You get it? Okay, sorry. Alrighty. So that is our temporal bone. Let's take a look at the parietal bone now. All right. So remember parietal bone, there's not a whole lot to know here. All right. So for our parietal bone, we have way in the back, sort of to the top back. All right. Can we see that there? We have, oh, right there. We have these parietal foramen. Right. Some of the skulls in our lab will have these. The real skull, you'll definitely see them. It's a really good example of it. But it's a little more difficult. Looks like I only have one over here. Maybe that's one. It's hard to tell. But I've got one parietal foramen. And that's it. That's all we need to know for the parietal bone. That and all of the sutures. So we'll do a quick review of that. Sagittal suture. Coronal suture. Okay. Okay, this is our squamous suture and our lambdoid suture up here. Okay. All right, let's go back to our facial bones. There's only a few things I'd like for you to know for the facial bones, and then we're going to look on the inside. All right, so let's start with our maxilla. Okay. So our maxilla here, all right, we have, so that's all of this is the maxilla. Okay. All right, so right here is the, let me see that. Oh, let's turn it over here. Maybe you can see it better that way. This is the infraorbital foramen. Infra, like inferior, orbital eye, and foramen because, well, it's a hole, and that's on our maxilla. Okay. And then we have also the maxillary sinuses. So this is going to be one that we're not going to be able to see on my model as well. Let's see if I can find a spot for it. But in lab, you're going to notice that they're in the real skull. We have a couple samples of the real skull. You're going to find that there's a big old sinus right in here. So that's going to be underneath, or rather above, your superior teeth. There's a big old space within this whole area. Okay, so that's our maxillary sinus. All right. All right, so that's the maxilla. And then I talked about the vomer here. Okay, this vomer. Zygomatic. This is our zygomatic bone. Okay, zygomatic bone right here, and articulates with the zygomatic process. Okay, zygomatic bone. Nasal bone. Come up closer. Our lacrimal bone. Okay. All right, let's look a little closer now. We're going to zoom right in. Okay, we have our ethmoid bone. Okay, so let's start with the ethmoid bone. Okay, and then we'll get to the, let's open this up. Okay, so now we need to learn how to look at the interior anatomy. Okay, so, okay, all of this is the frontal, right? The sinuses would be in here. Now this right here, all right here, looks like bat wings or butterfly wings, right? Right here. Extends all the way down right here. This is known as the sphenoid bone. Sphenoid bone. And it goes all the way up to right here. And within here. Okay. So it goes up to there and up to right there. Okay. So that's our sphenoid bone. Okay, so sphenoid. A couple things I'd like for you to know there. We also have sphenoid sinuses. Again, on these plastic models, we cannot see the sinuses. We'll look at that in class in the real skulls, but it would be located within here, and I believe a few little holes have been punched through, so that way you can see a little bit more detail here. Okay. Another feature, if you look this way, okay, let's see if I can angle it just right. Yeah. So right here, right there, this is the optic canal. I'll show you where it's going. The optic canal. So in here, we've got a fissure. We've got a couple of these fissures here, right? But this is an optic canal. So it's this one right here. Optic canal. So this is where our optic nerves are going to travel back into our skull. It's going to go to the back part of our brain, and as we'll learn later in the nervous system, all of our visual images are processed there. Okay. All right, so that is the sphenoid bone. The ethmoid bone. Let's see. There's not too much for us to know for the ethmoid bone. It's actually very difficult to see in here because it's mostly in the back of our nasal cavity. So it starts all the way back here. Probably get a better shot of it in class with a real bone. So it's back here, and right there. And we can see the top of it right here. This is known as the cristagalli. Okay, this little... Okay, so right about there. Okay. All right, so that's the top of the ethmoid bone. This is the inner part, the back of the ethmoid bone, or the inferior portion of the ethmoid bone. Okay, and let's see. Oh, we can actually see portions of the ethmoid bone if we look underneath. Right there, right here. So this would also be the ethmoid bone here too. So all of this bridging thing right here, this goes to the back part of our nasal. So we can see the nasal cavity is right there. Okay. Use this. You can see that. So nasal cavity. Okay, so that's the nasal. The ethmoid bone is not too much there. All right, let's take a look now at our mandible. So that's the last bone of the whole skull. Okay, here we go. So this is our mandible. Okay, a couple structures I'd like for you to know here. So first we have our, remember the mental, our chin. So this is our chin. This is known as the mental foramen. Okay, mental foramen. Right there, mental foramen. Okay, mental foramen. So this is going to be where when you go to the dentist and if they're doing any kind of work, they have to do some deep scaling or they have any kind of periodontal disease and they need to do an injection for cavities, whatnot, they are going to aim, they're going to put their needle to give you some local anesthetics. They'll put it right in there and they're going to aim right for the foramen, the mental foramen. Okay, and so it's right about there where that nerve is. All right, there's another foramen. So if they're doing any kind of dental work on the back teeth, like your wisdom teeth, for instance, and they need to extract them, they're going to go to the back side here, and we have the mandibular foramen. Okay, so here's the back. If we look down here, there's a foramen there, and here's the other one. Okay, now these are going to be found, the mandibular foramen are going to be found on the ramus or ramus, okay, of our mandible. This is the ramus, okay, the ramus, and we have the mandibular angle right here. This is going to be an important one when we learn about differentiating different skulls. For instance, in forensic anthropology, when we need to identify someone, we're going to be looking at the angle of the mandible, the mandibular angle. Over here, we talked about this a little earlier. This is the mandibular condyle. So this provides a nice smooth rocking surface for chewing, and that is going to articulate in the mandibular fossa right there. Okay, so you can see that nice rocking surface there. Okay. All right. Oh, another structure here. Let's go back to the mental. All right. Do you see this here? All right. Some of us have it. A little bump right there, some more exaggerated than others. This is known as the mental protuberance. Protuberance to stick out or jut out. Mental because it's our chin. Mental protuberance. All right. And that is it for our mandible as well as our skull. Thanks for watching. Bye.